There is a fundamental truth in neuroscience. Your brain does not wait for motivation before it initiates action. In fact, it's often the opposite. The very act of moving forward, of engaging effortfully with something, creates the internal chemical cocktail that we later label as motivation or drive. And this principle, grounded in hard biology, is the key to forcing yourself to work, even when you absolutely don't feel like it. Most people operate under a powerful illusion that motivation must come first. They wait for inspiration, for the perfect mood, for some spark of inner fire before taking action. But neuroscience tells a very different story, one that flips this belief on its head. In truth, motivation does not precede action. It is action that creates motivation. The very circuits in the brain responsible for drive and momentum are not triggered by thought alone, but by behavior, especially behavior that involves effort, friction, and forward movement. At the center of this process is the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, a system that runs through the ventral tegmental area and projects into the nucleus accumbens and prefrontal cortex. This pathway is not just about pleasure. It's about pursuit. It's about the feeling that something is worth doing, and it plays a critical role in helping us stay engaged, focused, and on task. When we take action, even a small one, the circuit begins to light up. Dopamine is released not as a reward for completion, but as a signal that effort is being made. That signal says, keep going, something valuable might be ahead. This has profound implications. It means you don't need to wait to feel ready. In fact, you probably won't. The feeling of readiness is a product of action, not a prerequisite for it. One of the biggest mistakes people make is believing that their internal state, whether they feel motivated, confident, or emotionally aligned, must be in a certain place before they begin. But the brain doesn't work that way. It's dynamic. It responds to what you do, not what you intend. Consider a moment when you've been sitting, stuck in indecision, knowing you need to start something, a project, a workout, a difficult conversation, but you don't. Your brain is calculating. It's weighing the perceived energy cost of the task against the potential benefit. If you stay still, the cost seems high, the benefit feels distant, and your nervous system leans toward inaction. But the second you stand up, open the document, or put your hands on the keyboard, that calculation changes. The motor circuits begin to engage. The prefrontal cortex comes online. Dopamine starts to trickle in. And suddenly, what once felt heavy and overwhelming feels doable, maybe even compelling. This is not about tricking yourself. It's about understanding how your biology works. The brain is designed to be shaped by behavior. It is not a machine that gives commands. It's more like a feedback loop. When you initiate a behavior, especially one that's hard, it tells your brain, this is important. And the brain responds by supporting that effort with neurochemicals that make you want to keep going. What this means practically is that the key to working when you don't feel like it is not to negotiate with yourself. It's to act in spite of your state. You don't need to feel courageous to begin something difficult. You don't need to feel energized to do something demanding. All you need is to start. The first step is everything, not the 10th step, not the finish line, just the first. And if you can take that step consistently, even when it feels pointless or uncomfortable, your brain will begin to change. You'll build what neuroscientists call task, bracketing, habit, structured neural patterns that associate effort with reward, difficulty with momentum. Over time, this rewires your relationship with work. You stop seeing resistance as a red light. You stop believing that you need to feel a certain way to be effective. Instead, you learn that action is a lever, that the fastest way to change how you feel is not to think differently, but to move asterisk. That is the neuroscience of forward momentum. It is not about willpower. It's not about discipline in the old, gritty sense. It's about understanding that your brain wants to help you, but it needs a signal. And that signal is effort. So the next time you find yourself trapped in that internal resistance, remind yourself, motivation is not the entry point. It's the byproduct. You don't wait for motivation. You generate it through action, through effort, and through movement. When you push forward, Even when you don't want to, your brain takes note. It adapts, it rewards, and it gets easier the next time. The difference between success and stagnation often lies in one simple factor: the time between deciding to act and actually taking action. The longer that gap, the more room there is for hesitation, doubt, and distraction to creep in. Neuroscience clearly shows that when we reduce this window, when we act quickly on intention, we increase our likelihood of following through. The brain thrives on momentum, and momentum begins not with grand action, but with small, decisive behavior. The key is to shorten the time between intention and execution so that the friction of procrastination doesn't have a chance to build. Every moment we delay creates space for the brain to rationalize inaction. This is due in part to the way the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for planning and decision-making, interacts with the limbic system, which governs emotion and impulse. When there's a delay between deciding to work and actually starting, the limbic system can hijack the process. It floods the brain with reasons to delay. I'll feel more ready tomorrow. I should eat something first, or I need to do just one more thing before I start. These rationalizations are not logical. They're emotional defenses designed to avoid discomfort. But when you act quickly, you don't give those circuits time to take over. You act before your lower brain has a chance to convince you not to. One of the most effective ways to close this gap is by using micro-behaviors, small, immediate physical actions that signal the brain to shift into a working mode. For example, instead of planning to write an entire paper, you simply open your laptop and write one sentence. Instead of waiting for the energy to go for a run, you put on your shoes and step outside. These actions seem trivial, but they trigger a cascade of neural activity. Once the motor system is engaged, the brain shifts from a passive, reflective state into an active, goal-oriented one. The body moves, and the brain follows. This principle is often seen in successful behavioral interventions. People who struggle with procrastination are often encouraged not to think about the entire task, but to reduce the task to the first 5 minutes. This works because it bypasses the fear center of the brain, the amygdala, which often lights up when we imagine doing something hard or unpleasant. But if the goal is simply to get started, not to complete the whole thing, the threat is reduced and action becomes more accessible. Once we're in motion, the prefrontal cortex takes over and begins to organize behavior toward a clear goal. The beauty of this mechanism is that it's self-reinforcing. The more often you act quickly on your intentions, the more you train your brain to default to action rather than hesitation. You begin to build a cognitive bias toward immediacy. This isn't about impulsivity. It's about decisiveness. It's about making your brain more efficient at moving from thought to action. And each time you practice this, you strengthen neural pathways that make it easier next time. There's another layer to this process, the role of identity. When you become someone who consistently acts on intentions without delay, your self-perception changes. You no longer see yourself as someone who hesitates or procrastinates. You see yourself as someone who is disciplined, reliable, and efficient. This change in self-image is not just psychological, it's neurological. The brain is plastic, and every repetition of fast action reinforces the circuits that support it. It's important to understand that this practice doesn't mean you'll never feel resistance. The goal isn't to eliminate discomfort. It's to stop letting discomfort dictate your actions. You may still feel tired, unmotivated, or distracted, but when you have trained your nervous system to respond to intention with immediate action, those feelings lose their power. You start anyway, and starting is the only thing that matters. In practical terms, this might look like using countdown techniques of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go, or habit stacking, where you pair a new behavior with an existing one to make the transition smoother. You might use environmental cues, like always starting your workday by sitting in the same chair, opening the same app, and playing the same music. These cues help trigger your brain into the appropriate state because they eliminate decision fatigue. The fewer choices you have to make, the faster you act. Ultimately, shortening the gap between intention and action is about building a system that respects how the brain works. It's about turning your decisions into behavior before your inner resistance can stop you. It's a form of neural training, and it's one of the most powerful ways to become more consistent, focused, and resilient, especially when the motivation isn't there. Most people interpret resistance, discomfort, or mental friction as a sign to stop. They believe that if something feels hard, it must mean they're not ready, not capable, or not aligned with the task. But this interpretation is deeply flawed and not at all supported by neuroscience. The truth is that friction is not a warning signal. It's a feature of effortful work. It's what the brain naturally produces when it anticipates a challenge. And instead of avoiding it, we must learn to see it as a gateway to growth and progress. Understanding this can completely shift how we respond to those moments when we don't feel like working. The human brain is wired for energy conservation. This means it will always prefer the path of least resistance, especially when the reward is distant or unclear. That's why when faced with a demanding task, one that requires focus, discipline, and time, the brain initially resists. It wants to maintain equilibrium to stay in a low-effort state. But the irony is that this friction, this internal resistance, is exactly what triggers adaptation and learning. Each time we engage with a task despite the friction, we teach our brain that difficulty is not a threat. It's a signal for growth. From a neurological perspective, the moment we choose to act in the presence of discomfort, we begin to engage the brain's executive functions. The prefrontal cortex lights up. This part of the brain is responsible for goal, directed behavior, decision, making, and self-regulation. When you override the desire to quit or delay, you are literally strengthening these neural circuits. It's like doing a mental deadlift. The more you lift against resistance, the stronger those circuits become. And over time, this builds what we call mental resilience and the capacity to persist even when conditions aren't ideal. There's a particularly important concept here. Dopamine doesn't just get released when you succeed. It gets released when you try, when you engage in a challenging behavior. Even if you're struggling, your brain releases small pulses of dopamine. These pulses act as a signal that you're on a meaningful path. This mechanism is biologically designed to reinforce effort, not just outcomes. That means you don't have to be perfect. You just have to move forward. Even a clumsy, unfocused attempt will begin to retrain your brain to associate action with reward. This is why friction is not only normal, it's necessary. It's a prerequisite for growth. Without friction, there is no stimulation. Without stimulation, there is no neuroplasticity. Your brain doesn't change when things are easy. It changes when it is forced to reorganize in response to challenge. That's how new habits form. That's how capacity expands. That's how confidence is built, not by avoiding struggle, but by facing it and proving to yourself that you can move through it. But most people stop too early. They misinterpret the initial wave of resistance as a sign that something's wrong. In reality, it's just a neural echo of the brain's default mode trying to conserve energy. When you expect this resistance, when you know it will come, and you prepare to meet it instead of retreating from it, your entire relationship with work transforms. The resistance no longer feels personal. It's no longer something to fear. It becomes a marker of progress. One of the best strategies for dealing with this is to build a mindset around effort over ease. Instead of asking yourself how to make work feel effortless, ask yourself how to become someone who chooses effort willingly. That mindset triggers a neurochemical advantage. By choosing effort, you align yourself with your own dopamine system. You become the type of person whose brain begins to crave the process, not just the reward, And once you reach that point, you've unlocked a sustainable source of motivation. It's also useful to measure success not by completion, but by initiation. Did you start the task despite the resistance? Did you sit down, focus, and make the first move? If so, you've already won. That moment is what shifts your neurobiology. That's where dopamine begins to rise. That's where the resistance begins to fade. It may not happen instantly, but it always follows action, not intention. Friction, then, is not the enemy. It's a companion. It's a sign that what you're doing matters. The goal is not to eliminate friction, but to work with it, to lean into it, to understand that each time you move forward through discomfort, you rewire your brain to become more capable, more disciplined, and more confident. And in that process, you become someone who doesn't wait for the perfect conditions. You become someone who acts in spite of them. When you find yourself stuck, unmotivated, or spiraling into procrastination, it's rarely just a psychological issue, it's a physiological state. Your brain and body are deeply intertwined, and how you feel mentally is often a direct reflection of your current neurochemical and bodily state. Understanding how to use simple physiological tools to shift your internal state is one of the most effective in science-backed ways to force yourself to work even when you don't feel like it. These tools don't require motivation, self-talk, or mental willpower. They rely on your body to send a signal to your brain that it's time to move forward. Let's start with the basic principle: mental states follow physical states. If your body is sluggish, your nervous system is in a lower arousal mode, likely dominated by parasympathetic activity. That's the rest and digest state, useful for recovery, but not for productivity. If you remain in this lower arousal state while attempting to do something that requires focus and effort, your brain simply won't cooperate. The key is to intentionally shift into a more alert, focused state by activating the sympathetic nervous system in measured, controlled ways. One of the most powerful tools for doing this is the physiological sigh, a technique grounded in solid neuroscience. This is a pattern of breathing where you take a double inhale, one full breath, followed immediately by a short top-up inhale, followed by a slow, extended exhale. This pattern offloads carbon dioxide and reduces physiological stress while increasing alertness. It has been shown in lab settings to reduce anxiety and improve focus in as little as 1 to 3 cycles. The beauty of this tool is that it takes under a minute and it requires no thinking, only breathing. You can use it anytime you feel sluggish, overwhelmed, or mentally blocked. It's a way of saying to your brain, "Wake up, we're shifting gears." Another powerful tool is cold exposure. Even brief exposure to cold water, such as splashing your face with cold water or taking a 30-second cold shower, activates a deep arousal response in the body. It boosts norepinephrine and adrenaline levels, which sharpen attention, increase drive, and elevate mood. These neurochemicals signal to the brain that something important is happening, and they prepare you for focused action. Cold exposure doesn't just wake you up. It changes your neurochemical landscape for several hours, creating the internal conditions that support work and effort. This is not about making yourself suffer, it's about using deliberate discomfort to flip the switch from passive to active. Physical movement is another underused but profoundly effective tool. Just 2-5 minutes of movement, jumping jacks, push-ups, a brisk walk, even shaking out your limbs, can dramatically change your state. Movement increases blood flow to the brain, raises body temperature, and elevates dopamine levels. It literally activates the motor cortex, which has downstream effects on focus and motivation circuits. When you move, especially in a vigorous or intentional way, you signal to your nervous system that it's time to engage with the environment. This is particularly useful if you're caught in a mental loop or overthinking phase. Movement disrupts those patterns and opens a new window of opportunity to begin your work. Light exposure, especially early in the day, also plays a crucial role. Getting sunlight into your eyes within the first hour of waking up, without sunglasses and not through a window, triggers a cascade of biological events. It resets your circadian rhythm, boosts dopamine, and supports cortisol release in the right proportions. These hormones help regulate your energy, alertness, and motivation levels throughout the day. When your system is aligned with natural light patterns, your energy to work, especially in the first part of the day, is dramatically increased. If sunlight isn't available, bright artificial light or light therapy boxes can mimic these effects to some extent. These tools don't rely on willpower, they rely on systems, and the more you use them, the more skilled you become at shifting your state on demand. Instead of being a passive victim of your mood or mental state, you become an active participant in shaping it. You stop waiting to feel like working, and you start generating the internal conditions that make work possible. The core idea here is simple but powerful. You can change your mental state by changing your physical state. You don't need to wait for the perfect mindset to begin. You don't need to overcome procrastination with sheer mental force. You need to intervene at the level of your nervous system. That's the control panel, and with practice, these tools become second nature, giving you the ability to flip the switch and get to work, even when everything in you says not to.